Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. When I think of fireside chats, of course, I think of our former president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So there is a fire next to me here. Wendy's got hers going, so to be sure we got that checked. When I think of President Roosevelt, I think of gravitas, intellect, and credibility. So I've long aspired to be him. My mother would probably give me a hug and say, keep going. My father would roll his eyes and say, I'm a little thin in all of those departments. However, Wendy Young is, her bio is full to bursting when it comes to gravitas, intellect, and credibility. So you are in for a treat today as we have this discussion. So Wendy, why don't we start off with, when we talk about these emergency intake shelters, what are they and how did the government, the United States government, come to establish them?
Sure. Well, thanks, Hardy, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm looking forward to the discussion and hearing your questions. So how we got here, very good question. What has happened, the starting point for this is really looking backward 4 years when the Trump administration started to implement a series of border closure policies that made it increasingly difficult for children and families to cross the border and request protection under our asylum laws and under what's known as the TVPRA, or the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which codifies particular protections for unaccompanied children in need of protection. So this culminated in March 2020, of course, when the Trump administration instituted a full border closure under Title 42, which is a relatively obscure public health law that allowed them to suspend compliance with the protections under the Trafficking Act for unaccompanied children, as well as our asylum laws more broadly. What that resulted in, of course, is tens of thousands of people who are in desperate search of help backing up on the Mexico's northern border, or in some cases being returned to their home countries. So once the new administration came into office this January, they began to initiate some measures to lift those border restrictions, starting first with lifting most of the restrictions on unaccompanied children and started to allow kids to cross the border again. So bottom line, where I'm going with this is that there was a suppressed demand to migrate. So kids started crossing. On top of that, of course, the conditions in the primary sending countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, the so-called Northern Triangle countries of Central America, have not improved during this period of time, and in fact have worsened thanks to political instability, the pandemic, which has had a devastating effect on the region, as well as 2 major hurricanes. So there's also additional desire to leave the region and seek protection in the United States. And in many cases, these kids are also seeking to reunify with family members that are already in the US. So this is why we've seen the uptick in numbers since starting in that kind of January, February timeframe of this year.
Wendy, are these EIS facilities meant to be around for a long time, or is it or short term?
This was, frankly, the emergency intake sites, or the EIS facilities, are really a triage measure on the part of the Biden administration, because what quickly happened as the numbers climbed was the regular shelter care space that's set up to care for these kids until they can be released for family was quickly overwhelmed. And it was overwhelmed, yes, because the numbers were high, but also because of pandemic restrictions on the space. So ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is responsible for the care and custody of children, was only able to use about 50% of its regular bed space. So the space that they had, again, was quickly overwhelmed. So the administration turned to setting up these EIS facilities, which are ad hoc, very large facilities that house hundreds of or even thousands of children in some cases on a temporary basis. The administration has been clear that they did this because they had no other choice. They do not intend it to be permanent. We certainly hope it won't be permanent based on our experience working in these facilities and our recent visit there. But I will say that, in the moment, we agreed with the administration that better to have kids in these facilities than backed up at the Border Patrol stations where conditions were even worse, or worse yet, pushed back into Mexico or back into their home countries. So to a certain extent, we've, if you will, tolerated this interim measure so that, and have tried to work with the administration to improve the care and custody situation and the processing of these kids so that we can get them in and out of federal custody as quickly as possible. But this is a far from ideal situation that we're currently in.
When you said that this is far from ideal, let's step back a bit. You have had many years of experience working with unaccompanied children and seeing them sheltered. Tell us a bit about that experience. What have you seen through the years, and how does this model compare with what you've experienced?
I actually started working on this issue in the mid to late 90s when we were still working with Legacy INS, which goes back a ways. And back in that time period, there were very few unaccompanied children who arrived in the U.S. each year. That the year that we started drafting legislation to address the situation, which was around 97, there was a total of about 432 kids over the course of a year. We've now seen more than that number arrive in a single day in the current time period. So, but what INS would do in that time, more often than not, they did have some limited shelter space available, but they also very frequently would rent space from counties and municipalities in juvenile jails and basically house the kids there. And the whole system was really grounded on the presumption that these kids don't require safety. The best thing for them is to process them out and deport them. So it was a really kind of a turnstile system that had some very, very tragic results. So at that time, we started to work with both the administration and Congress to build a new system that really met kids on their own terms, that was more child-centered. And that ultimately led to three things. One was a settlement agreement in the Flores class action lawsuit, which was addressing conditions of confinement for children. Two was passage of the Homeland Security Act in 2003, which transferred custody of the kids away from the INS when it was dissolved in that act to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which to this day still has that care and custody function. And then third, ultimately, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act in 2008, which further codified the conditions in which children should be housed, the range of family members or sponsors to whom children can be released, and establishing certain services that are essential to these kids, including the groundwork for providing them with legal services, which of course is one of the key pillars of KIND's mission.
When you're sticking with the key pillars of KIND's mission, you've talked about the work that you do with undocumented children when they're here and they're at the border. Let's go back a little bit. I know in the short time I've been working with you that one of your strengths and main areas of focus is addressing the reasons that children are inclined to leave or have to leave their homes in the first instance. How does that effort, the root causes of migration effort, link up to what you are doing in the emergency intake sites?
Sure. Well, when KIND launched 12 years ago, it was part of our original business plan to also look at the root causes of why child migrate to the United States to begin with. And that's really grounded in the premise that it's generally not a good thing for a child to be forcibly displaced from their home countries and moving across international borders alone. And that true solutions very, very, very often lie in their home countries if we can create conditions of stability and safety, love and hope for kids in their countries of origin. So we have very much, really since 2014, when the first major wave of child migration occurred, but since then have been encouraging a greater focus on addressing the root causes of child migration out of the Northern Triangle countries of Central America. So that includes a focus, for example, on the prevalence of gender-based violence in the region, which is a primary driver, particularly for girls out of the region. So we're hopeful in this moment as we're, kind of living the fourth wave of migration since 2014, that we're now in a moment where I think policymakers are beginning to, frankly, understand that there's no magic solution to this child migration situation, and that we do have to look at these issues holistically, including investing in the region strategically and bringing innovative partnerships together, if you will, to really create stability and restore the rule of law in the sending countries.
Wendy, you mentioned the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So I gathered when I was there that they are in the lead, if you will. But are there other players, and to what extent are they truly leading the effort? I mean, how would you describe the sort of the structure and the management of the emergency intake center?
Sure. Well, let me back up and say that Hardy and myself, along with another teammate from Kind, traveled to Fort Bliss on June 8th to assess in real time the conditions in which kids were being held in the EIS that had been set up on the military base. And we were quite shocked by what we saw and quite concerned by what we saw. So, sorry, Hardy, I forgot your original question.
Yeah, give us a sense of, at these emergency intake facilities, we know there's the Office of Refugee Resettlement, but
who's running it?
Who's running it?
Yeah, so the kids are in the custody of ORR, as is established under our laws. However, these facilities are being run by a range of actors. And has been reported in the media. What this has resulted in is kind of almost, I would describe it as a hodgepodge of activities, responsibilities, but frankly, a lack of clarity in terms of who's responsible for what. And I think this is creating some of the protection gaps that have been so widely reported in the media that are causing tremendous trauma to the children. And frankly, what we saw was a system that is not child-centered, and resulting in kids remaining in custody for much longer periods than they should, and particularly in the conditions that we witness.
Wendy, give us a sense of the scope of this facility? And I know it's one of several that the government runs, but give us a sense of how many children are we talking about? And then if you could say something about how long are the children supposed to be there, and how long are they actually there, from what you can gather?
Sure. Well, ORR opened 15 of these emergency intake sites, these EIS facilities. Now, since then, some of those have been closed, I think for a range of reasons, some because of conditions, in other cases because the facility was really designed for another purpose, such as the convention center in Dallas, and is now, as we pull out of the pandemic, hopefully is reverting back to its normal purposes. So the ORR has vacated those facilities. So it looks as if they're quickly heading towards Fort Bliss being the last of the EIS that will remain open. EIS is designed to house up to 10,000 children. The peak population that has been housed there was somewhere around 6,600. As of today, they're down somewhere around 1,500. So the numbers have dropped. But this is in part, I'm fairly certain, because we're also in that part of the season where migration generally drops in the region because of the heat making it impossible for people to move. So we're left with Fort Bliss. Really have no clear indication of whether they plan to permanently shut the facility down or not. While we were on site, we did see that construction was continuing. They haven't quite reached that 10,000 capacity. So this may be a facility, while designed to be temporary, may be with us for a while, we fear. The numbers have been extraordinary, really, over the past several months. I believe March was the highest, when 18,000 children arrived in 1 month, which really exceeded by far all historical numbers.
Wendy, can you tell us a few words about who are the children that are being sheltered at this facility? We know that many of them are likely from the Northern Triangle, but if we were to believe what we read, the narrative might be that these are sort of junior drug runners or something along those lines. I imagine that's not your experience, but can you say something about who are these children?
Yeah, no, these are really children who are fleeing very dire circumstances in their home countries. And I'm sure many who are on the line today realize that there's a great deal of volatility, violence, conflict in Central America that very specifically targets young people. Gang activity is a huge driver of young people out of the region. So the vast majority of these kids that are housed in these facilities are desperately in search of protection. And they're also trying to reunify with family who are already in the US, who hopefully can provide them with that kind of safety and stability that's been lacking in their lives. So in Fort Bliss in particular, they have used the facility to house teens ranging in age from 13 to 17. Some of the other EIS facilities were used to house children of tender years, that's defined as age 12 or under. And Kind has been operating in some of those facilities as well.
So when there's a person or persons responsible for doing that vetting and doing the processing to get the children out of the facility, did you see any of that at work?
Yes, there is a contractor in place that's in charge of what they're calling case management. That's basically the vetting of family members to whom children or other adults to whom children can be released. I have to say the process is a bit of a mystery. And it's been a source of great concern that these cases are not being processed rapidly enough.
And do the children have access to education or mental health services? I mean, any sense of the support that they have while they were at the facility?
Yeah, the education is provided, it seems fairly ad hoc from what we could tell. It's provided by volunteers. It's done in the same tents that the children are residing in. In terms of other support systems, obviously a huge issue of concern is the trauma that these children are experiencing, both by what they've experienced in their home country and en route to the United States, as well as the reception here in the United States. And there have been numerous reports of delays in the provision of mental health care and the adequacy of the mental health care that is provided. So that has been a big issue of concern, and also have been reports that children have tried to self-harm. So, but I will say this in closing on the mental health aspect of this, ultimately, I think the best thing for these children's mental health is to get them out of these facilities as fast as we can.
Well, Wendy, I'm seeing a question about what agency is responsible for all these services. Is it still, at the end of the day, under the umbrella of the Office of Refugee Resettlement at the Department of Health and Human Services?
Yes, that's correct. And I will say this, the care and custody functions were transferred to ORR back in 2003, as I mentioned previously, for one very good reason, which is still valid, which is having these functions lodged within the same agency that was also responsible for prosecuting the children for quote unquote unlawful entry and removing them from the country, i.e. that's what INS would do, was a highly conflicted responsibility. So one of the reasons that it was decided to move the program to the Office of Refugee Resettlement was to break that conflict of interest. I still believe we need an entity that's dedicated to the care and custody of these kids that has nothing to do with the adjudication of the underlying immigration case. Unfortunately, I think we need to really look at this system more closely, realize it was designed way back when we were dealing with a very different situation and many fewer children, and rebuild this system for the situation we're in now, because I think the arrival of thousands of kids a year is our new normal. So I think it's time to revamp the system and really resource it and build up ORR to be able to step into the role that it's been assigned.
And realistically, if you look at rebuilding the system, Wendy, what's a realistic time frame for a child to be housed at a place like an EIS facility? You said some of them are there 30 to 60 days, which is way too long. But what's a number from your years of experience that makes sense, if there is such a?
Well, specifically to the EIS facilities, I hope that there will never be a need for us to visit Fort Bliss again, because they'll reach the point where the systems, reformed and processes are expedited appropriately so that kids don't have to go into these ad hoc, inappropriate facilities, which, by the way, are not licensed under state law the way the regular ORR programs are. So hopefully we'll write this out of business. But having to more directly answer your question, Hardy, I think, at most a week in a facility like that is even that is too much for a child. But, in this triage moment, if we have to fall back and utilize facilities like this, that would be it. But the moment is now to really start rebuilding the system, because one thing I think we can be fairly certain of is these cycles of migration are going to continue until we get a handle on it. And there is no one magic solution to this. We really have to address the system from start to finish, looking at conditions in the home country, looking at protection frameworks throughout the region, including in Mexico, looking at orderly but humane border processing, care and custody systems for kids that keep kids in custody for the shortest amount of time possible in appropriate conditions, and then really focus on the kids post-release and provide them with wraparound services that they need to help them finish out the immigration process that they're still in, but also to help them get their feet on the ground, reunify with family safely, and start their lives in the United States.
I zoomed in on the work that Kind is doing at the EIS facility. Let me zoom out now and ask you, how does that work relate to some of your larger strategic goals, particularly back to that seamless safety net idea? How does it mesh?
Kind is digging deep right now and trying to build a campaign to really look at this issue holistically. This is actually something that we've been encouraging and working towards since 2014, but really feeling that now is the moment, because we can't keep doing this. We can't keep going through these cycles. So what we're doing is really building on our operational expertise and our advocacy expertise to try and look at the issue holistically. And what I mean by that is to encourage new approaches to how children are housed, to encourage a greater concentration of services to kids once they're released from these federal facilities, including access to legal counsel, but more than that, access to mental health care, access to support and enrolling in school, help with family reunification, trying to build an adjudication system that recognizes that these are kids first and foremost. So with the number of children that are arriving in the United States, now is the time to start thinking about, we need a children's immigration court. We need a children's asylum office. We need officials who are highly, highly trained on how you address a child's asylum claim in an adjudicatory system. We're looking at, again, building out our work in Mexico to help Mexico really live up to its international obligations to provide asylum in appropriate cases, and training Mexican authorities on how to adjudicate children's cases. And finally, again, going back to where we talked a little bit about, which is the ultimate solution, which is not going to happen overnight. It will take time, but really to address the root causes, the reasons why these children are leaving their home countries to begin with.
Wendy, can you those policy asks more of them in the reality of today's political administration? I mean, how are things speaking in terms of relating with this administration? What's the prognosis? How do things look? And maybe compare and contrast with the last administration to give the listeners a sense of, what might the road ahead look like? Yeah.
Well, I do think that there is goodwill in the current administration to address all the very damaging measures that the prior administration took and put in place to undermine our asylum system, as well as our system for protecting unaccompanied kids. So they're reviewing all of those changes that they inherited and moving forward, I do believe, as rapidly as they can. Secondly, I think this is the first time, and I include the Obama administration in this, where I think there's recognition in the administration of exactly what I just said, which is there's no single solution here. So we need to look at it holistically. And I think the vice president's recent initiative to address the root causes in partnership, in a strategic partnership with philanthropy, with civil society, with the corporate sector, with governments, is a new and novel approach that I hope will work, because I think it's intentionally being designed to recognize that these issues can't be fixed within the four corners of the Biden-Harris administration. This is going to take years. And we really need to build a sustained attempt to address the root causes. So in answer to your question, Hardy, I have hope. I've worked in and around government for 32 years. We're going to have to keep encouraging them. And I think we're going to have to share with them good ideas and help them get over the finish line. But I feel like there's more of a moment now than we've seen in the past several years, at least.
Let's move over to our Q&A, Wendy. I see a question from one of our audience members. Says, in Montgomery County, Maryland, she's hearing that they're going to soon receive approximately 1,000 unaccompanied minors. How are decisions made about releasing these children? And is it the county that's accepting responsibility? Is it the county that has to accept responsibility? Or are there individuals who are being vetted to receive these minors in the county, if you know? No. And also, if you want to say something about best practices.
Sure. Yeah, complicated set of questions within that. And it really does vary jurisdiction by jurisdiction. But to back up, about 90% of the kids that are in ORR care are ultimately released to a sponsor, and most typically that's a family member. Roughly, I believe it's 65% of those are actually released to a parent. So the first kind of front line of care, if you will be that family who's receiving the child. Having said that, obviously the child's situation is still very much in flux and in transition. So it's important to bring to the child services to help them navigate the very complex immigration laws that we have in place. So that's where the provision of legal services, as well as social services, because what we have found in our work at Kind is to address a child's legal services in the absence of addressing the trauma and other, many challenges that they're facing in their lives is difficult. So you really have to be holistic in your approach. In terms of the reception that kids receive at the state, county, municipal levels, it really it varies from location to location. Montgomery County happens to be one of those that I think is more receptive than many others. So that's where, our local offices across the United States are really reaching out to their government counterparts at those levels to try and advocate for as many services as we can at that level to support the children. But B is also to help the child obviously navigate what is available. So there's a lot of work that we do on that front, and it's very critical work.
Wendy, how, if at all, is the U.S. federal government investing in the countries of the Northern Triangle and in Mexico? What sort of partnerships is the government building, and maybe even give us a trajectory? I mean, because you've seen this happen before, but so give us a sense of, again, you have hope. So what is that hope rooted in on this occasion?
Yeah. Well, Vice President Harris announced what they're calling the Partnership for Central America. And through that, she's invited the private sector to deploy its assets and resources, civil society, both at the local level in country, as well as through international NGOs like Kind, to deploy our expertise and understanding of these communities. Development agencies are also being invited into this mix. A range of government agencies, most notably probably USAID, will be involved, as well as philanthropy. And the idea behind this, the premise behind this, is to kind of pool all of our energy, our expertise, and our resources, and build something that's really targeted at communities that are generating migrant families and children. It's still very early days. I believe it's now 14 corporations have signed up, including our founder, Microsoft. So we are deep in conversation with some of the potential partners in this to see where our expertise and energy can line up with others and what we can do together, because I do think it's going to take that kind of collective effort as opposed to kind of one-off programming or a government-only effort. It's obviously an extremely challenging region to work in, but I think it's a new approach, it's a new idea, and hopefully it'll work.
The collective effort of civil society really stepped in when we had family separation policies back in place a few years ago. What linkages, if any, Wendy, can you make between those policies of yesteryear and what we're seeing with how unaccompanied children are being treated today?
Yeah, well, I think probably everyone's aware that when the families were separated under the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy, basically children who arrived accompanied by a parent were redesignated as unaccompanied and tracked through that system. So it was a very cynical manipulation of protections that are on the books to protect unaccompanied children, to render children who had traveled with their parents even more vulnerable. Just a really tragic chapter. So, but I do think that there's one kind of theme through all of the work with unaccompanied children, whether they were forcibly separated through that policy or arriving unaccompanied, which is, for most kids, hopefully the first line of defense will be their family, and getting kids, together with their family should be the, top priority in this entire system. So going back to Fort Bliss, kids sitting on a military base in these huge tents, no privacy, few services for over 60 days, that's clearly should not be the goal of this system, right? So we really have to, kind of scrub the entire system and identify procedures that we can get kids to families safely as quickly as possible. I will say this, based on many years of working in this field, this vetting of family is also essential though. We can't just release kids at the border to anyone who claims to be a family member. We have to ensure that those family reunifications are truly viable and safe, because these kids are in very, very unusual circumstances, and unfortunately there are a lot of people who are happy to prey on them.
Yeah, let me carry that thread, Wendy, about the praying. I mean, obviously you have these children sitting in far from ideal conditions at the border in shelters, not with their families, which is where they really need to be. Is there a profit motive here that we ought to be mindful of? I mean, one would hope not, but is there an element of that we should
in the EIS facility?
EIS facility, yes.
I mean, the fact that there's 16 contractors in place, many of which their mission doesn't necessarily align with this kind of programming. I do worry about that. And, there's been some media reports about some very, very, very major government contracts being awarded in this emergency context. I think it is something that we have to really keep a very close eye on. One thing that I think is important as we hopefully revamp the system of care and custody is, I think, moving towards a model that's more kinship based. And what I mean by that is, kids belong with family. Kids should be living in the smallest setting possible if they can't be released to a family member quite yet. I think the smaller the facility, the more home-like it is, the more supportive of the child it is. And also, frankly, I think it would end up being cheaper. So hopefully we'll start looking at some of these alternative models as we move forward, so that, again, Fort Bliss becomes a thing of the past, and we never see kids housed in that way again.
Wendy, in terms of the patterns of migration, we're seeing maybe low numbers this summer, but I would think you would expect the numbers to perhaps peak up a little bit come fall. If that is indeed the case, what's the messaging that we should keep in mind, or the narrative that we should keep in mind as we think about the political context and the media's involvement when these numbers start going up in the fall? What's as folks go on about their daily lives and leave this presentation, what's a messaging thread you'd like them to keep in mind?
Yeah. Well, first, the numbers I don't think are going to go low. The numbers are still really high, but they're lower than they were, a month or two ago. So, and I don't know how low they might go over the summer. But I think that the main takeaway I hope people hear is we don't have a day to waste. And even if the numbers drop, in the next couple of weeks, that's not a time to say, done, it's over. Because what we've seen since 2014 is it's not over. It's going to pick up again. So let's start preparing now. Let's start building the kind of system that I've been trying to outline today now, because, the kids are the ones who pay the price when we don't get it right.
And Wendy, for those who are watching this, how can they be of help here? Particularly, obviously, a lot of your work has been legal focused, not only, but much of it. For those who want to support, whether it's locally or perhaps nationally, what are some specific things that they might be able to do to support unaccompanied children?
I would say broadly, just to the point that we just discussed, is keep the focus on. I think, raise awareness, get the word out in your networks. Certainly, support in terms of in-kind, as well as, always resources, financial is critical. I think that there's, as I said at the beginning, there's a moment here, and I think we can't let it slip by. So hoping that all of you will be interested in partnering with us as we try to push things forward.
Recognizing that there's a moment here, we also are aware that there's politics here. So we have Governor Abbott in Texas doing what Governor Abbott in Texas is doing, and will continue to do. What's the likelihood that we could move facilities out of the state of Texas, such as EIS type facility, for example, and move them to somewhere else where the children would be better cared for, and perhaps frustrate what the governor is doing? Any real likelihood of that happening?
I don't think so. And I say that because a huge percentage of the beds that are overseas are in fact in Texas. And of course, Texas is just geographically the state, right? So I don't see that happening. I think that, unfortunately, Governor Abbott's chosen to use these children as a political football. I think his trying to say that this is taking resources away from U.S. citizen children who are in need, I think is a very kind of manipulative framing of the issue. So I hope that we'll be able to just push back on that notion that, the hanging a sign at the border of Texas, stay out, is not the right approach. So we'll see. I'm not privy to the conversations that I'm sure are happening at the Department of Health and Human Services about how they're going to respond to this. I understand they're thinking of litigation, but they may also be thinking about, in the future, let's try to move into other states that are more receptive to the programming.
Wendy, collaboration is at the heart of everything that KIND does. Can you say something about how we collaborate with our NGO partners at the border and organizations such as UNICEF and Save the Children?
Yeah, we have been partnering with a wide range of NGOs in the immigrant and refugee rights space, of course, but we've also been trying to build out new partnerships. So just to flag one who's been very prominent in the discussion around how unaccompanied children should be treated is the American Academy of Pediatrics. As an organization that has a lot of lawyers on staff, it's great to be able to talk to an organization that has a lot of doctors on staff because we know what we know, we know what we don't know. So that's just one example. But again, on looking at the root causes, can we build out corporate partnerships? So for example, talking to Microsoft about they plan to deploy tech assets to the region in response to the vice president's request. Could we use those tech assets to deliver the kind of programming we're already doing in Central America, but on a broader scale? So we are ready to partner with whoever wants to help from whatever perspective.
Wendy, in working with the government, one of the things that many of us who looked at the government or been in the government, we know one of the challenges of government is the siloing of different agencies and departments and not necessarily communicating with one another. Is there any sense of hope do you have on that front? Are things changing with this administration? Where are we?
I have hope. I think that, government is government, and those kind of bureaucratic instincts tend to kick in. I have seen some evidence in this administration that they're trying to break through on that. I do think that there's something that's missing that they had put in place early on, which is a high-level White House official whose job it is to bring everybody together and get them to cooperate. So you may be aware that early on they had appointed Ambassador Roberta Jacobson in that role. She made it clear at the beginning she didn't plan to stay long. She has since left, but they haven't really replaced her with anyone. And I would really encourage that. Vice President Harris is now in this situation. New news breaking on that today that she is going to the border at the end of the week. But I'm not sure if I think it needs to be somebody besides the vice president.
I'm seeing a question back to the Governor Abbott point. And Wendy, you talked about Texas being a large place or a place where many facilities have been sheltered and will continue to be. Are there other options along the border like New Mexico? And I know there's a facility in Southern California, but are those not equally viable options when compared to Texas?
I think that part of the challenge there, putting aside California for a second, in a place like New Mexico, is there's not as many arrivals on the New Mexican border. So, and there's always this tendency to want to locate the facilities as close to the border as possible for logistical reasons from the government's perspective. So I think that's why you see, and of course for Central Americans, the Rio Grande Valley is a huge arrival spot. So I think that's why you see this tendency to want to move into Texas instead. Now, having said that, I don't know what they're looking at in terms of trying to expand their partnerships with other states along the border and whether how much success they might need on that front.
And looking prospectively, Wendy, obviously your team jumped in a moment's notice to work in these ad hoc emergency facilities, and that had certainly some impacts for you. Could you foresee yourself continuing to do this type of work at the EIS facilities? I'm assuming it should persist for a little while longer. Hopefully it won't, but if it does, is KIND the go-to organization on this?
We're not the only go-to organization, as we do legal services with a broad network of legal services organizations across the country, some of whom have deployed in other EIS. But I will say that, if we're asked, for example, if Fort Bliss is back up and running, hopefully not, in the fall, if we're asked to come back in, we will probably respond to that positively, because I do believe that we've become a critical source of information for the kids, and to a certain extent, a source of comfort to them. Because what my staff is projecting is, we're on your side, we're here to help you. And these kids clearly, they're traumatized, they're desperate, they're confused. So if we can do that on some even small scale, then I feel an obligation to step up.
And as one of those key organizations that's working at not just the IS facility, but in so many other places to provide comfort, shelter, legal services to children, I get the sense that you have a lot in the toolbox, but what, if anything, are you missing in that toolbox? Or what could you use more of, Wendy?
More, I mean, frankly, a lot more bodies, which takes a lot more resources. One of the big issues that the entire community is grappling with right now, there's an estimate that there'll be over 100,000 kids who arrive this year. The NGOs that are providing these kids with services post-release are already strapped. So how we're going to absorb this new population, I don't know. And it's something that we're trying to think through now. But I think there's a sentiment across the community that we're strapped, and we're not at all clear how we're going to do that. And also, I think, as probably everybody on this call realizes, when you take on these cases, you're taking on a multi-year obligation. Because these cases, because of the backlogs in the immigration courts and the asylum offices, these cases are taking years to adjudicate. So it is a heavy responsibility, and we do it, with great heart and with great commitment. But as the numbers keep climbing, there's more and more pressure on the system post-release too.
And does the government provide any lawyers for these children? I mean, I've once heard that some of these proceedings are have death penalty implications in a traffic court environment. Right. So you have children who also don't speak the language. They're understandably overwhelmed by the system. If you're not by their side, who is? What's the government's role, if any, in this?
Yeah, well, the general rule is that the government does not fund legal representation for immigrants in deportation proceedings. However, for unaccompanied children, there is a slight exception to that that's codified as part of the Trafficking Act that I mentioned earlier, where the Secretary of Health and Human Services is charged with facilitating pro bono representation or volunteer representation of children to the maximum extent possible. That was a compromise. The original legislation actually mandated counsel, but we weren't able to get that over the finish line with Congress. What that has enabled is at least some resources coming through the government to help stand up organizations like KIND, to do as much work as we can. Having said that, pre this most recent uptick in arrivals, still over half of kids were going through deportation proceedings without a lawyer. And you infuse 100,000 more kids into that system, and that rate of representation is going to plummet. And that's tragic, because kids who are represented by counsel are 70 times more likely to win their case. KIND wins 95% of our cases, and that's simply because we have a trained lawyer standing by the child's side in the courtroom, helping them understand that they have to prove a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So try being a 5-year-old and being required to demonstrate that before a trained immigration judge with a trained prosecutor from the Department of Homeland Security arguing for your removal. It's impossible. They can't do it.
Daunting, to say the very least. Wendy, one of our audience members asks, when they hear your statistics, why is it that there's so many more children in the system? Is there a primary root reason? Is it more poverty, more violence? Is it the pandemic? What can you attribute it to, one thing, or not possible?
No, it's not one thing. And I think that's, the primary driver out of Central America is instability and violence. But that's also very much, intertwined with deep poverty, the more recent impact of the pandemic, the hurricanes, climate change is becoming a bigger and bigger factor in the region. So all of this is kind of piling on and making it impossible for kids to remain home. I sometimes get asked the question, why do parents do this? Why do they send their children out? And my answer is, these are some of the most selfless parents out there, because they're trying to save their children's lives. And you can imagine how extraordinarily hard it is to make the decision to send your child alone out in the world.
We have a question about what is the go-to agency for when it comes to psychosocial care of these children while they are in these facilities? Who are the players in this concern, knowing that every minute, every day creates deep trauma, which will roil our society, will roil on for years?
Yeah, well, it is primarily ORR's responsibility, but they will bring in contractors to provide those services. There's been changeover at Fort Bliss, and I have to admit that I'm blanking on the name of the contractor right now that was on ground when we were there, Hardy, maybe you remember. But then it's taking the lead on mental health, provision of mental health.
ServPro, or Chinagan, I believe it was.
That was it. That's it. That's it. Yeah.
I think someone said, by more bodies, do you mean more attorneys? I think this was, you were talking about that.
It is attorneys, yes, but it's more than that. What we have found over time is it's very important to build out, for example, our core of paralegals to support the attorneys, and very importantly, to build out our core of social workers to provide services, the vast range of other services that kids need after release. So it's all of that. The other thing I should mention is we're also exploring the use of greater use of technology to reach more kids, not kind of self-education material so that the child can represent themselves in court, because I just think that's just not a tenable proposition, but to connect attorneys to their child clients more efficiently through technology, and perhaps even to connect the child to the immigration court through technology, at least for their what are known as their master calendar hearings, which is the preliminary proceedings where it's not where the decision's actually made, but it's almost like a check-in hearing, if you will, with the immigration court. We had some interest in doing that under the Obama administration. It was suspended during the Trump administration. So we're planning to go back and raise that idea again and see if we can get some traction. Because what you see is, the sources of legal support for these kids tend to be heavily concentrated in urban areas where a lot of the kids are, but there's an awful lot of kids that are slipping between the cracks.
And when you can't get a lawyer to these children, and it sounds like you're doing a great job doing that, but you can't get to every child, Wendy, do models sort of like these know your rights sessions where a lawyer speaks to a group of children, do you see impact there? Is that moving the needle as much or making a difference?
I think it's a critical first step. I don't think it's the full solution. You can't in a 1 hour, 2 hour session really fully educate the child about the system that they're in. Plus, again, recognizing the lack of capacity that many kids have to absorb this kind of technical information. But I think it's at least an opportunity to help the child understand you are in a process. You actually may have a very high chance of success if you stay in that process, and it's important that you do stay in, and it's most of all important that you have a lawyer to help you through it.
And as we're starting to close out here, Wendy, you have offices in multiple cities throughout the United States, Baltimore to Fresno, and many of our audience members are located in those local communities. How can they pitch in? What can they do with that kind office, or how can they be of help to you? Because I have a sense you have an army of volunteers here who are ready to jump in the fight and be at your side.
Yeah. First of all, we're happy to connect you with our local offices, and hopefully give you an opportunity to see us in action and see kind of the system in action, if you will. But yes, we value our volunteers, and they aren't just lawyers. There's many things that members of the community can do to help these kids get their feet on the ground. One of my dreams, by the way, is to hire a volunteer coordinator at Kind, because we find that there's a lot of energy and a lot of people who are not lawyers who really want to help these kids, and we really want to capture that energy, because I think anything that supports these kids I can't. It's just so rewarding to do it, and it is so important to do it. So happy to help you.
Wendy, this has been a broad-ranging conversation where it's clear to us that you have a vision for the future and how to rebuild the system, and Kind is really well positioned to do this and provide that seamless safety net of protection. So thank you. There are many comments here. I'm not able to read all of them, but the sense is, thank you for your tremendous leadership and for being in the forefront as you have been for years. Knowing that these unaccompanied children have Kind and you at their side, I think should allow all of us to sleep a bit easier at night.